Now we're going to expand our understanding of race by including ethnicity. Race is imposed usually based on physical differences. It's hierarchical, exclusive, and unequal. Race is an ascribed status that you're born with. Ethnicity is voluntary, self-defined, non-hierarchical, fluid, cultural, and not as closely linked with power differences. Ethnicity tends to be more symbolic. An ethnic identity becomes racialized when it is subsumed under a forced label, such as a racial marker or a sense of otherness. The Amish, for instance, are a distinct ethnic group in American society, linked by a common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are also white. The Jewish people, on the other hand, contrary to what the Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, are an ethnic group but not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they're not completely linked. Race is an umbrella term, and it holds lots of ethnicities. Within the racial category, there might be some ethnic groups. Race is an umbrella term that holds lots of ethnicities, and sometimes these ethnicities and races can overlap. Think of it as a Venn diagram. Symbolic ethnicity is ethnicity that is individualistic in nature and without real social cost for the individual. Using a symbolic ethnicity or displaying one does not impact the day-to-day lives of individuals. You might have made a friend recently yet had no idea that she was of Irish heritage until St. Patrick's Day, when she proudly displayed her ethnicity. This ethnicity may not impact the day-to-day lives of people of Irish descent, but it becomes relevant in this occasion. This is an example of symbolic identity. Whites who explore and express an affinity for their European roots can be said to be adopting a symbolic ethnicity. It makes them feel good about their heritage, and it's something that they can focus on and express when they choose to. It isn't an identity that they must assume all the time. On the other hand, some ethnic and racial backgrounds are not symbolic. Some ethnic and racial groups face tremendous stereotyping and discrimination. Watch Because I'm Latino, I Can't Have Money. We're now going to talk about minority-majority group relations. Minority and majority does not mean population size, but rather about who has the most power, relegated to their group. Pluralism in the context of race and ethnicity refers to the presence and engaged coexistence of numerous distinct groups in one society, with no one group being the majority. Pluralism not only permits racial and ethnic variation within one society, it actually encourages people to embrace diversity, to exchange the traditional melting pot image for a salad bowl or a mosaic. At the core of multiculturalism is tolerance of racial and ethnic differences. So a way to think about this in terms of a math problem to make it more symbolic, think of A as the dominant group and B as the minority group. What we have on one side of the equation is A plus B. If we're talking about pluralism, we should see as the resulting answer to this equation, A plus B as well. No one group has to change. They can coexist as they are. Next, we'll talk about segregation. Segregation is a legal or social practice of separating people on the basis of their race or ethnicity. Segregation was the official policy in the United States, particularly in the South, until the 1960s. Although it has been illegal for over 40 years, there is still ample evidence to suggest that segregation in American society is still occurring today, particularly in schools, housing, and in prisons. What we see today is that race is tied to systemic inequalities, institutional inequalities. How have groups responded to domination? There are 4 general ways in which they have responded. They are withdrawal, passing, acceptance, and resistance. Acceptance and resistance can actually be closely linked, as members of an oppressed group might appear to accept their subordinate position while internally they feel enormous resentment. Withdrawal occurs when a group of people want to leave a society to start their own. Passing is when individuals within a group, usually a subordinate group, are able to pass because they look physically white and they change their culture to be able to integrate into white society, they have a lot of cost to that. They cannot return home. They'll have some potential deficits to them or even physical harm if found out to be passing as white. Acceptance occurs when the oppressed group Passing occurs when the oppressed group accepts the ideologies and practices of the society rather than changing it. Somehow they find that they benefit in some way in that society. And resistance is when people have an understanding that the society does not benefit them, it actually harms them, and use various measures to resist or to overcome their oppression. Overt collective resistance can take the form of revolution, nonviolent protest, or riots. Where do systemic inequalities stem from? They stem from prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice refers to negative thoughts and feelings about an ethnic or racial group. Discrimination refers to harmful or negative acts against people deemed inferior on the basis of the racial category. It is important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an internal evaluation, and discrimination is an action. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it is important to know that that's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced yet not discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate yet not be prejudiced. For instance, a manager may not hire Chinese people because other people in the office don't like Chinese people, although the manager doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. I would like for you to watch The Eye of the Storm, and you'll see how quickly prejudice is learned and discrimination is put into action. Next, I would like for you to watch Prejudice versus Discrimination, Individuals and Society. While overt racism, for the most part, is considered unacceptable in American society today, there is a new kind of racism on the rise in America and elsewhere that focuses on cultural and national differences rather than racial ones. Many people argue that the new racism is even more dangerous. Although overt racism is definitely problematic, at least it can easily be seen and pointed out. Now we'll talk about race in institutional context in the case of wealth. A wealth gap exists between whites and minority groups in America that has historical roots and cannot be overcome simply through achieving income equality. Public policies formulated to address white, non-white disparities have not paid close enough attention to this particular legacy of racism. Let's think about functionalism again, in particular Max Weber's idea of life chances. His idea states that our opportunities in life are different depending on the class in which we are born into. We talked earlier about how race and gender intersect with class. How could a person's race affect their life chances? Here's an example. Healthcare is an area in which we find widespread disparity between racial and ethnic groups. Disparities in access to healthcare may help explain the life expectancy rates of men and women of different races. The 2000 census created separate categories for race and ethnicity, and for the first time allowed people to check off more than one box for racial identity. These changes have given us a better idea of the diversity of the American population. It is predicted by 2050, whites will no longer be the majority of the United States. It's predicted that by 2050, whites will no longer be the population majority in the United States. This change could bring about the narrowing of the definition of white, as happened in the 19th century as whites tried to demarcate boundaries around their group in relation to the growing minority groups. Dr. Jennifer Lee explains how sociologists think about race and describes the differences between race and ethnicity. Please watch this video using your code. In this interview, Jennifer Lee explains how sociologists think about race and describes the differences between race and ethnicity. What are the differences between race and ethnicity? What are some examples of expression of ethnicity rather than race? Lee talks about her research on race. She notes that race in America was once divided in two, black and white. Now, with more Asian Latino immigration, the racial dynamics are changing in the United States. Some people argue that the divide, or the color line, is between whites and others, but Lee views the color line as between blacks and others, including but not only whites. So instead of a white, non-white divide, it'll be black, non-black divide. She argues that for Latinos and Asians, immigration status is more important than race. What are some media depictions of blacks, whites, Asians, and Latinos that support Lee's view about the color line, as moving from white, non-white to black, non-black? How have the four forms of minority-majority group relations been prevalent in the United States? How have minority groups in the United States responded to racial domination? What do you think is the future of race and ethnicity in the United States? Decades after real estate segregation or redlining became illegal, many Americans still live in communities that are highly segregated by race and/or socioeconomic status. How does unofficial segregation occur? Please watch the video attached to your book.